we are meeting today on July 30th to talk about the book, the Titanic Survivors Book Club. And we are very fortunate today to have the author, Timothy Schaffert, here to speak with us. I am going to be recording this, and hopefully we will be able to share this. Okay, so let me go. So, Timothy, you want to get started? And you already read his bio, so he will be adding more information that was not in his bio. Okay.
So, excuse me, I have a bit of vocal atrophy, and so I will try to project. So, um, but yeah, so a lot of people wonder how this book came to be. I actually wrote a whole other book that dealt with some characters' preoccupation with the Titanic, and it was originally set in the 1920s, and this group of filmmakers decide to make a silent movie in the desert of, of California, based on the sinking of the Titanic. And I worked on it for years, actually, until finally it just didn't seem like it was working. I couldn't make the things connect the way I needed them to connect. And so I wrote a whole other book. I wrote The Perfume Thief, set during World War II in Paris. And I guess then I just kind of wasn't done with Paris. And so I wanted to have this character with a bookshop. And that's around that time I had this idea of like, well, what about the idea of people um, who are supposed to be in the Titanic but weren't, and how they might contemplate their own sense of luck and fate and fortune, uh, and its proximity to grief and heartbreak, loss. And so, in various conversations, I hadn't written the book yet, so I was talking about it with my editor, and eventually the book club concept came into play. So that wasn't really my idea, but once it was, I started thinking about, oh, well, that could be very interesting for people to really explore um, what their own sense of luck, what their own sense of survival means to them in relationship to these books that they've been assigned. And so then it became a process of not just studying Paris history in 1913 and figuring out the shop and where it would be located, but also the books that they would read and the books that they might discuss. And so that seemed like an enormous thing to try to take into account of all the possible books that they might choose. And so I found myself narrowing it down in terms of thinking about books that might have been challenged at some point at that point in history, books that were banned or burned by preachers, or all the various acts against books that people can have historically. And so once I started coming up with those lists and really looking into the books and their history of publication, then they started suggesting how they might fit in with this club discussion. And so the books sort of announced themselves in terms of how they might relate to characters contemplating their own survival. And I guess probably to a certain degree, most books lend themselves to those kinds of conversations because those are the things that we bat around, when or the characters in our fiction do in terms of these life and death issues. So yeah, so the characters kind of emerged somewhat organically. I started writing in the wrong direction first. And so I had the idea that I was going to I figured out the narrator and I was going to start with his childhood. And then eventually, and of course, so I'm writing all this stuff despite any sense, with no sense whatsoever, that was completely the wrong direction. And it was sort of obviously the wrong direction. And so but once I figured out that really a book called the Titanic Survivors Book Club should start with the book club, then the characters all just kind of started showing up, I guess. And I started thinking about them in relationship to each other and who they might be and how they might relate to Paris history. And then they just started talking to each other. And the book kind of emerged from that. but is there anything I can tell you about the book? Do you have any questions?
Well, there's a
You
tremendous.
said that you had a lot of introduced a lot of books. Now that would be because of your background.
I guess, I mean, I asked people, I asked my colleagues for suggestions, and and then I can't read. I mean, I was kind of just looking to see what I subscribed to newspapers.com, which is like an archive of American newspapers. And I subscribed to the New York Times, which I can tap into that archive. And I use Google Books a lot, where I can uh, limit the search so that I'm just looking at conversations from 1850 to 1920, for example. And so and then I kind of and I also visited the university library and went into the archives, and the librarian presented actual books that I could consider their physicality, because that's another thing that the book is, that my novel is kind of about, is not just the content of the books, but the structure of the book itself, the design of it, the considerations of of how books were published, and who were the publishers, and so I was particularly interested, like, in the evolution of the picture of Dorian Gray in the aftermath of Oscar Wilde's imprisonment and trial and death, and how that book uh, spoke to the culture in various ways of Paris in the 1910s, and so that and and our library had an actual copy of an English edition published in Paris, uh, and with a signature from the book's editor. And so that was exciting. It's always and actually all the books that are referenced and even illustrated are books that actually um, editions that actually exist, that you can find out in the world in libraries and collections and such.
I really liked part two, where the entire story is laid out through letters that they've written to each other. Why did you decide to handle it in that particular way? What was the importance of letters to you?
Well, I think once I figured out that the novel would focus really on these three characters, that the narrator, Yorick, Zinnia, the Japanese American candy heiress, who's based on a friend of mine, and Hayes, I started to think about, like, well, what is going to happen between them, and what shape will this romance take, and what kind of anxieties and jealousies um, and heartbreak and love will emerge from this situation, and so the letters came about as I started thinking about Cyrano de Bergerac and the classic tale of Cyrano characters, but beneath the balcony, and the courtship that Cyrano takes part in from a distance, even as he's falling in love with. And again, I'm forgetting I'm forgetting everybody's name, but and so I wanted to play off that in terms of these book recommendations, I guess, and these book conversations. And so the idea, it appealed to me, this notion of um, somebody who's well read, somebody who loves books, um, creating these love letters based on books uh, for somebody who doesn't know books at all. And so I had a lot of fun writing those letters. And so they're interspersed in part one, and then it did kind of lent itself to part two, which really needed um, to cover a lot of territory in a little space. And so and it also allowed for all three of the characters' voices. So so it's a first person, the novel is told in first person from Yorick's point of view, but the letters allowed for Zinnia's actual speaking voice to come across, and really, and Hayes's too. So, yeah, it was, and then a process of like figuring out like, well, what are they going to write to each other about, and where are they in the world, and what is happening in the world, and what's that issue when you're trying to write letters and trying to communicate during World War I. And so that led me into a whole other avenue of reading and sharing books and sharing words, and the effect of censorship, and not just on letters sent through the mail, but through the books themselves. And so then that indicated that Yorick should work as a censor in part 3. So, which kind of also speaks to his inclinations, or actually, in contrast to his inclinations as a librarian for the Titanic, when he was collecting banned books, in essence, books that had faced the threat of censorship, and then ended up, ironically serving as a censor himself during the war.
That's very interesting, because right now the libraries are facing a lot of challenges. Those books that you would never think would be challenged. There's always some group that is finding a reason why it should not be on the shelves. But you talk about the letters. I mean, isn't that a lost art now? When you think of that.
Yeah, and I think that was another reason I sort of enjoyed indulging in it and thinking in terms of what even would the physicality of the letter be, and then when I learned about the processes of letter delivery in Paris, and the pneumatic tubes, and how and the particulars of sending a letter through a pneumatic tube, which is different than sending a letter through the post. And so all of these discoveries in searching through the history lend themselves ultimately to the narrative. And so I feel like I sometimes don't really think of my work as historical fiction, because I'm not necessarily trying to educate anyone about any kind of historical moment. I'm trying to just place the characters at a particular point in time, specifically a point in time in the past. And so I end up looking through all the material and researching, but I'm trying to filter, my brain is kind of filtering it through the perspectives of the characters and the environment and the world that I'm trying to create. And so then the things that lend themselves to the themes of the story, and any sense of irony, or what might inform the characters' imaginations, really kind of steps forward and announces itself. And so ideally, I'm creating a portrait of Paris that you're not going to find anywhere else, even though I am using all the guidebooks. I am, and historical record and all of that. But one morning I woke up a couple of years ago, before I started writing this book, and I didn't know, I was in my bedroom, and I didn't know which door led where, like which went to the bathroom, which to the hallway. And then I went to brush my teeth, and I wasn't sure where the toothbrush went. And so I was very disoriented, and I realized that I'd lost whole chunks of memory, and I'd forgotten that we were in the midst of a pandemic. And so it was, it turned out I'd likely had a stroke, or a mini stroke, in the night. And so that one of the things that I lost in that process was a sense of how to read maps, basically. So when I looked at a map, it just looked like mush. Like I couldn't make any sense of it whatsoever. It's now come back. I now can, but I think part of the process of it coming back was learning about Paris in 1913. And so I found myself, so The Perfume Thief was also set in Paris during World War II, but I didn't really stick too closely to the map of Paris. I mean, I had a vague sense of where everything was, but by nature of it being World War II and then needing to walk every place, I kind of had to like create somewhat of a fictional neighborhood. Whereas with this book, I really wanted to capture what was actually inherent about the city in 1913. And one of the ways I did that was through maps of the day. And so I situated the bookstore in a very specific place on a specific street. And when Yorick would need to go to the opera or go to the cemetery, I would figure out how long it would take him to get there if he was walking, what kind of conveyances he would use if he was riding, and what those conveyances might cost. And so I found myself like really hyper-focused on the realities of these character situations in that particular place and time. And I think that helped me kind of step out of this brain fog that I'd found myself in. And so so for me, like that's that particular corner of Paris is really burnt into my memory now.
That's interesting because I've never heard an author say, they actually walked or whatever.
Lorraine, we can't hear you.
Oh, that's interesting because I never heard an author say something like that where they maybe walked a distance or to somewhere to figure out how long does it take to go there or whatever for a book. When you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. The sense of time that give a feeling of these things, in your writing. But I wanted to mention something funny. I was reading the book, and to be honest, when I first started reading the book, I didn't even look at the author's name. I just started reading the book, and I saved this page to read this to you. On page 38, you say something interesting. It's about Zinnia. And that's when I knew there was a man writing this book. And then I turned and looked at the authors. Zinnia made a gesture to tuck the loose curl back, but I suspected it had been engineered to dangle. Only a man would write the word engineered. A woman would write that, and right away I said, oh, it's a male author. On page 38. So I said, I got to save that for the book club. I just thought that I think you'd get a kick out of it.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, like, I feel like I really do, when I'm writing for the point of view of a character, or even when I'm trying to figure out how a character who's maybe not the narrator, but I'm trying to figure out how they might interpret certain situations, it is kind of like an actor getting into character, and you're trying to figure out yourself how you would respond to a situation, how you might describe a situation, but also then you want to be conscious of the character's voice and character's imagination too. So and that was really kind of one of the reasons why I did feel like I wanted to know how long it would take a character to get from one place to the next, even though it ultimately didn't matter. I mean, it's not, nobody's going to hold me to that or anything, but it, for my purposes, it did kind of give me a deeper sense of how these people navigated their city and in essence then their lives.
Well, I thought you did a great description. You gave a lot of description, very good detailed description of the characters. You really got a feeling for them very quickly in the book. And that's what I liked about it,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that I really liked. I enjoyed that.
I found it interesting that one of the characters that in the beginning was probably sort of disreputable Hayes, in the end, really ends up being the most, I don't know, noble and makes the greatest contribution. He's almost redeemed at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's somebody who comes from, humble beginnings, right? I mean, I guess Yorick does too, which is part of the reason Yorick connects with Hayes and perhaps partly how their friendship emerges. But Hayes in particular, is kind of motherless and fatherless and has found his own way in the world. And his particular fascination in his art is taking pictures of buildings that are doomed, that are about to be torn down in order to make space for the new Paris that was emerging. And so yes, I'm glad that came across. And I don't know that I necessarily knew or anticipated that that's how things would go. I had various ideas as I was writing where I thought the novel might end up. And I mean, I think I kind of knew all along what Hayes's fate would be. But I also, he needed to be, I wanted him to be kind of bizarre and perhaps interesting and mysterious and maybe even a little dangerous. But also I want for the character, for it to be realistic, that the characters might fall in love with him or come to, at
But
least
he was
adore him.
also lacking in the one thing that was key to both Yorick and Zinnia, which was being able to read and write.
Right, yeah, yeah. And yeah, and that I definitely didn't know about him at the beginning. It was only kind of as Yorick took the pen to tell Hayes' story for him, or to romance Zinnia on his behalf, that it seemed like, in all likelihood, I mean, it would be expected somewhat of his upbringing that he might have been uneducated or undereducated. So.
I found it interesting that Yorick bought this bookstore in Paris, which must have been like a dream of his. He loved books, and he's going to do something now. I was saved from the Titanic, but yet he wasn't happy. It's just like it took him quite a while to really, I don't know if he ever actually really did find the happiness he was looking for, which I felt kind of bad about.
Yeah, and I so talking about my mini stroke. So I did go in for an MRI, and that's how they discovered the kind of white spots on my brain scan that suggested that might be what had been happening to me. There was also a black spot, a brain damage, basically. And we speculated that that's probably from when I was 18 months old, and I was at the stock car races with my parents, and I walked off the edge of the bleachers and fell 7 feet and landed on my head on cement. And that was always, in my family, that was kind of, I grew up, it was sort of a joke, really. I mean, it was something that, like, oh, that's why you're so strange. That's why you're so, because I had 2 older brothers. And so it was, and I grew up at a farm. I grew up with a family of laborers, but I was the artsy type. I liked to draw pictures. I drew cartoons. I read all the time, and I wrote from the time I was a little kid. And so, and I spent a lot of time. So yes, we had the farm, and I would go out. My brothers would make fun of me because I would go out and just wander around. Like I would just walk. I would like beat this path. Draw the pictures or write about it or whatever, which I still do. I still pace constantly. But so it was like, it was only kind of years later when I asked my mother, I said, well, what did you think? Like when you saw me go over the edge? And she said, well, I thought I'd find you dead. And that really shifted that perspective of that story, right? That it from the you know, this kind of comical approach to, oh, what a clumsy little tale of a little boy who walked off the edge and got weird, to, you know, this, what could have been this really tragic situation. And so I think that, but I think that it speaks to how I always kind of had perhaps a perverse preoccupation with my own survival, you know? And so it's, and then before, just before I started writing this book, I was in a car accident where I was driving along the interstate, and there was this deluge, you know, there's this storm, and I was driving through this construction area where there was some flooding. So my car started fishtailing right there on the interstate. And as I'm fishtailing, I'm thinking, oh, this is, I'm going to die. And because, you know, as we often say in accidents, it always feels like it's in slow motion. We have a lot of time to consider our plight. And then the car drove into the middle part between the two parts of the interstate, which was also flooded. And so I wasn't able to control my driving through there. And so I thought, oh, I'm going to drive right into the oncoming traffic. This is how I'm going to die. And then the car kind of moved to the side. And I thought, oh, I'm going to roll. This is how I'm going to die. And then I didn't roll. Then the car just stopped. It just miraculously stopped. And then you have this feeling of like, oh, I'm never going to die. I'm immortal. And so like, once again, I'm safe from death. And so so then I, you know, somebody happened to see it, and he called 911. And so the ambulances were arriving practically at the moment that I stopped. And then they kind of checked me out, and they said, well, you can just drive away. And so I thought, oh, okay. And so I drive back onto the interstate, and as I'm driving, I'm like, I'm feeling that there's something wrong with the steering column. I thought I should not be driving this car. And then there was that returned feeling of mortality, right? It's like, oh, this is how I'm going to die ultimately. So there's just like this kind of constant awareness of irony, I guess, or the like just how thin that thread is between, you know, survival and you know, the opposite. You know? So but it's, and so yeah, so I think that ended up not even, so I think it's kind of from that this idea of characters who had tickets to the Titanic but didn't board might have their own peculiar relationship to some sense of having survived one of the biggest, you know, most famous, notorious ocean disasters. So
Kitty, how old were you when you wrote your first book?
so I actually wrote my first book when I was still in college. And so I finished a book set in 1947 in a rural town in Nebraska. And I won a couple of awards for it, and there was some interest. I sent it around, but that was in like 1991. And so I was, however, I was like, I don't know, how old was I, 23, I guess. And but I didn't realize that you need to be rigorous about these things. You know, that if you have a book and you want to get, I mean, today, like my students, when they write a book, they're sending it to like they're just they're submitting it to agents, to every agent that they can submit it to. And so whereas I was sending it out like maybe once a year or something. And so so I was not, so I don't know that I necessarily, even though I had finished the book and I wanted to be a writer, I'm not sure that I had a clear sense of the possibilities, or that I think there was a part of me that thought, well, it's not in my blood. It's not, it's probably, I'm not probably fated in this way, but you know, if something comes up, I'll send it away. So then at one point I decided, instead of revising this novel again, I would write a new one. And that I wrote it a couple of years. I think when I started that, I might have been about 30. And then I got an agent with that, and then she sold it a year later, and then it came out a year later after that. So I think I was maybe 33 when my first published novel came out.
Sounds like you've written a lot of books.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, of the books that I've written from beginning to end, this is actually my 9th, because there's 2 books that I wrote that I never published. So it's and I've started anew. So
Well, if you choose to write another one, the character that I was most taken by and would want to know more about was Zinnia.
oh yeah, yeah.
And I really like the, you're bringing in the Japanese culture, which made her particularly interesting.
Well, like I said, she's based on a friend who's a Japanese American friend that she's been my friend for 30 years, and she's introduced, her mother's from Japan, and she's introduced me to a lot of Japanese culture, especially Japanese food and candy, especially. And so I've gone into Japanese stores with her over the years, um, and so I've had great appreciation in learning about her culture and her family's culture through her perspective. And so, I'm not sure exactly how I came to decide to create Zinnia and to make her who she is. But again, I think it's one of those things that just ends up announcing itself as you're trying to, figure out these characters and what's unique about them and what I can bring to them based on what I know or what I feel like I can learn to know.
Were any of your characters based on anyone who really did miss the Titanic, or all yours total figures of your imagination?
Yeah, they're all figures of my imagination. I mean, it's funny because a lot of times when I speak to book clubs or meet with groups, somebody will say, "Oh, my dad's great aunt had a ticket on the Titanic." So a lot of families have this legacy of somebody who just barely missed the boat. But historians suggest that there's really only about 50 true cases of that are documented, of people who were actually, for whatever reason, supposed to board, or those who did board but then got off before it actually set off across the Atlantic. And so, but I decided to make them all up. I wanted to invent my own survivors, and they only mention, there is one Titanic survivor mentioned my name, and that's the man who was the real library steward of the second class library. And so, and he actually, he did not survive, but I mention him by name when and I'm forgetting her name, the character
Tommy Kelland.
Who?
I think it was Tommy Kelland or Tommy.
Yes, like Kelland, yeah. And then my character who shows up, Opal, who she actually was on the survival, actually did survive the Titanic, and I think she's the one that mentions and speaks of having met the librarian. But and her, if you recall, there's a moment when she's at the opera and the crowd rises up and cheers, and that's when York recognizes that she's not a fraud, that she actually experienced the sinking of the Titanic because of the genuine response to the noise of the crowd and the fear that he saw in her and her physical collapse, and
her hearing the voices of the voices of the ones who were on the Titanic as it was sinking.
Yes, and that was an actual memory from one of the Titanic survivors who said that at one point he was living near Wrigley Field in Chicago, but he had to move because the sound of the cheers during ball games sounded so much like people drowning that after the sinking of the Titanic, that he couldn't bear it. And so that was a detail that I did borrow and manipulate for my own novel. And I read a lot of books about the Titanic, and not just for preparing for this book, and not just preparing for the other Titanic book that I didn't publish, but just growing up with a fascination with it. I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I guess we're all somewhat fascinated by it, and I think partly because it is a story of, as my characters say, you know, kind of survival of the fittest, and the fittest being in this case first class. You know, it's an interesting, because there were famous people, because there were rich people, because these people who were so privileged in so many ways and so lucky in so many ways would find themselves on the precipice of death in this way. So I think, so there's something about that really captures our imagination, and certainly captured mine. And it was something that I read up on over the years.
That's very interesting because, you know, even young people are fascinated with the Titanic. We have a lot of books on the Titanic, and my like 2 years ago, my children's librarian had a program about it, and what struck them is the whole class structure of the people on the Titanic. The differences between the rich and the very rich and what they were eating, and then, you know, all the way down. It was just amazing.
Yeah, and the whole industry, you know, is fascinating, and the White Star Line and its other ships. And I mean, who's to say whether we would even know about the Titanic now if it hadn't sunk? You know, if it had continued to you know, sail back and forth for years until it was retired. You know, and that was you know, another interesting part of the history, was to discover how those ships were then commissioned by the Navy during World War I, and so these luxury liners and the role that they played. There was one of the ships actually sank and it was full of war horses, and I kept wanting to incorporate something about that in my novel, but it's just too, it was too, for some reason, that the idea of horses drowning was just too depressing. Like I just couldn't, it was a vivid image, but too heartbreaking. So I did manage to kind of suggest it in a dream that Hayes has in one of the letters that he writes. But that's, you know, that's the other curious thing, is you're writing about this book and you're trying to, I mean, in many ways, I think of a book as an entertainment to a certain degree. You know, I think we read to be enlightened, or we read to be moved, or we read for the poetry of it or the visual effect. We also read for the story. We also read for the distraction. We also do want to be moved and excited and heartbroken, and so so there's something kind of visceral about the act of reading, and trying to balance these questions of grief and loss with that sense of story, and sense of drama, and sense of wit and irony and beauty. I mean, and to keep it from getting too ponderous or too weighed down in its big questions, I guess. I know that one of the first things I did was in trying to figure out, because one of the questions you have as a writer, I think, is like, how much does the reader need? How much information do I need to convey? How much do I need to tell you about this character before you'll understand him? Or how much you need to know about their motives before this will make sense? And so you're pondering all of these fears and anxieties that you're not providing enough, or you're providing too little. And so I was particularly concerned, or particularly preoccupied with, how much attention together in order for us to feel invested in their love affair. And so I watched movie of this woman and two men, and this navigation of their relationship and the ups and downs of it. And so I watched it, and then I watched it again. And then when I watched it again, I made notes. I would pause it, and then I would write whatever happened in every scene and what every scene was. And even though I ended up not actually using that or including it in my consideration of how much attention I needed to give each movement of the characters, something about having done that did answer my question somehow. So like I did commit it to the unconscious in a way that I felt, at least I felt a little more confident in terms of figuring out how much time the reader needs to spend with these characters in order to become invested in what they're invested in. And of course, you hope that you're right? As a writer, you hope that you're actually making the exact right decisions. You know, you obviously don't want to be indulgent or to spend too much time on something you be spending less time on. You know, all of these kinds of you know, you're conscious of the reader and the reader's experience with the book, even as you're not really thinking of any specific reader. You're kind of thinking of yourself as a reader, I guess. And so on the one hand, you're trying to tell the story, you're trying to communicate, you're trying to move with the moment of the writing. The other time, you're also hyper conscious of that connection that you're seeking. So
Well, I
yeah,
think
so
there was the right amount of information. It made me rush to Google for the word cliche, and it made me Google Ira Aldrich to see if he really
yeah,
existed. So there you go.
good, yeah. And yeah, and you know, pretty much every detail in the book is Googleable to a certain degree. I mean, there's more to know about practically every line. I mean, obviously there's things that are made up, but the details of the world itself are ones that are drawn from all the various sources that I've looked at. So, or at least mean to capture the essence of the character of the town at that time. So I mean, I think some readers would say there's too much of that sort of thing. I mean, I know that readers read for different reasons, and so some readers just like, I know some readers who just tell me the story, just give me the plot, just get me from the beginning to the end in the most efficient manner. And then, but I'm the kind of reader who loves to be arrested by a paragraph or a sentence or a turn of phrase to the point where I want to pause and stay in that moment for as long as I can. And I'll reread it, before moving on. And so it takes me, so I'm a very, very, very slow reader. And I'm not, and I don't even, I mean, I'm not terribly interested in plot as a reader. I mean, I don't even necessarily even notice it. I mean, I think I notice pacing. I think if I feel like it's moving too slowly and I'm not, it's not expanding where I want it to be, then that's when I'll put the book down. But I love when writers just wax poetic, I guess.
You are a professor of English, so how do you how much time do you get to spend on your writing, or during like the academic year? Is it just like at the teaching?
Well, it's funny because technically, contractually, you get hours towards research, and so like almost practically half your job is supposed to allow for research, but that doesn't end up being the case. So like when you're teaching a class, that could take any amount of time because it's a real wild card. I mean, and plus, I think I've always been torn between the act of reading and the act of writing. So when you're in that space where you want to engage with books, you might do that as a writer, or you might do that as a reader. And if you feel like if you're writing, you feel like you're not reading what you want to be reading, and when you're reading, you feel like you're not writing. So it's a constant conflict, I think. But And so that just kind of plays out in my job too. But I mean, I do my best. I always tell my students, and this is kind of how I've approached my writing for years, is that there have been times when I only write on Saturdays, so I go through the whole routine, I romanticize the whole day, and if it's a rainy day, perfect, but I make a pot of tea, I pace around, I play music, and I really make it kind of um, even almost like a sensual experience, like it's in terms of really placing myself in the world of the fiction, and 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 on those days when it's flowing most smoothly, I could get like maybe 10 pages of new stuff written. And so if you think of it in those terms, if you can get 10 pages a week, then you have a pretty healthy draft within like 6 months. So yeah, so that's not quite always how it goes, because sometimes I write 10 pages and then the next week I throw it all away and write a different 10 pages. But or it's sometimes it's happened where I've written the whole book and only until I've gotten to the end do I realize what the book's about. And I think, oh, I have to go back to the beginning and reconsider everything, and reconceptualize so many aspects of it. And so it's there's too much of this when I really want to be exploring that. And so and sometimes it takes you until getting to the end of the novel to figure out that that's what it means, or everything it means, or who the characters are and such. So that's it can be time consuming, but for me it is kind of like meditation. I was just listening to Julia Louis-Dreyfus has a podcast, and I think it's something like Wiser Than Me or something. So she interviews women that she considers wiser than herself. And so she's had, Jane Fonda and Patti Smith and Amy Tan and any number of, and Gloria Steinem, any number of remarkable women. And I was listening to Fran Lebowitz, her interview with Fran Lebowitz, who often boasts certain, or at least speaks to, or laments that she's had a writer's block for basically her whole life. And so she has these book contracts, and she always misses the deadline, and so she was talking about how she finds writing challenging. She doesn't enjoy it. And she said, I think if you're a writer who enjoys writing, you must be a terrible writer. And so, and I can see her point, but I like to think that I can enjoy my writing and perhaps still write something readable.
So right now you're not facing any deadlines then, or do you have something that you have to get out there?
Well, actually, you've caught me at a moment when I'm in the process of putting together a proposal. So sometimes I've written the whole book and then my agent has sold it. And other times I've written some sample pages and a description, and my agent has sold that. And then I have a deadline. And so, that was the case with the Titanic Survivors Book Club. I kind of hoped that I had these ideas for, I had that one book that I'd written about the Titanic, and I had these ideas for how I might revise it. And so I wrote down the new stuff and then worked into my proposal the stuff I'd already written. But my editor liked only the new stuff and not the stuff I'd already that I was proposing that I already had ready to go. So it ended up being writing the whole thing from nothing. And at the time it was like, I think I sold it the concept in November, and I had a deadline of a year from January. And at the time I thought, no, there's no way I'll meet that deadline. But I said yes. And so I ended up, and I thought, well, we could just change it. Once we get a little further, we'll just push the deadline back. But my editor was having none of it. She's like, you need to get this book done. And so you make it happen. It's, even though I had, I think when push comes to shove, we really do try to make time bend to our needs, I think. And sometimes we're better at that than others, but it can be possible. And so, but I don't always sleep. So I'm sometimes up at 4 a.m. writing. And so that ends up being some good writing hours when everything's just the still of the night still. But
Well, thank you so much for being here. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add? We're almost at an hour, so like I don't want to keep him that much. You may have a deadline you have to write for. What time? Where are you now?
I'm in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay, so you're actually earlier than we are. We're getting to
Yeah.
8:30 p.m.
Yes. So I
Let's see, I
shoved
wanted-
some dinner in my face and then came and did this talk. But
Timothy,
so
I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite book that you wrote?
favorite one that I wrote. Well, I always say it's the most recent one. I feel like that's when the stuff that's freshest in my mind. And but I think that my book, The Swan Gondola, I have some affection for. I think it's probably too long. There's probably too much of it, and probably too many of those uh, meanderings where, as a writer, you follow a path into the woods every now and again before you write to yourself. And so, but it's it's a book that that I think I could see myself sitting down and rereading. Yeah.
This book was put into audio. Have your other books been put into audios?
Well, The Perfume Thief has an audio edition, and then a novel called The Coffins of Little Hope you can listen to, and one called The Singing and Dancing Daughters of God is audio. And I think that's all.
How large a class did you usually teach when you were teaching?
So, so this fall I am teaching. So I have 26 students in a literature class. And if it's a creative writing class, and that's an undergraduate class. And so in a creative writing class, we have smaller classes. And so that can be anywhere from like 18 to 25, or 14 to 25, I think, depending on the level of the course. Now the graduate courses are capped at 13. So so in our graduate program, our students actually get a PhD in creative writing. And so their dissertation is a novel or a collection of poetry or a collection of short fiction of book length. And a lot of times they get them published. So one of our students, Clara Jimenez, she just won the Penn Faulkner Award for a book that she wrote as her dissertation, What Happened to Ruthie Ramirez. And so a lot of our students come to our program already having an MFA, and then they have 5 years to really finesse and have a project.
And how frequently do you have students come in when you're just sitting in your office, pick your brain, and complain about him being not able to do it, whatever the subject is? Obviously, you must teach many subjects, not just one.
Over the years, I've taught quite a few subjects. There are those teachers whose students always come and talk to and need more from. And I find that like the students that want to talk to me don't come talk to me about the class. They just come to kind of like talk about, I guess they talk about their writing. And I think they sometimes are curious about the process. And because especially the writing students are really often quite serious. And for a lot of them, publishing a book is a dream, and I mean, it was a dream for me, and it still kind of is sometimes. I still sometimes think, well, this can't possibly be my life. You know, I'm the farm kid that fell on his head. You know, this is not. I didn't expect that I'd be, you know, writing historical fiction all these years later. But so yes, I think that, and I actually adore my students. I mean, I think that. The young people of the world are full of life and energy and are bright futures ahead of themselves and will lead the world in the right direction. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, it's
Thank you.
fascinating.
Very insightful.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate the time, and thanks for reading.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're
I
very
wanna thank
welcome.
you for recreating a real character for me, a book dealer for 50 years that I used
Oh,
to
nice.
do every Saturday when I finished work.
I love it.
12 o'clock. And what would show up is that the college professors would come in. I was a trial lawyer, and they educated me. I finally got educated when I left school.
I bet that's the way it happens a lot.
Well, we'll be looking out for your next book, and hopefully soon. And thank you so much for spending the hour with us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
Good night.
Thank you,
Thank
Mimi.
you.
Yeah.
At 4 o'clock the other night. You kept me up to 4 o'clock
Oh.
the other night because I wanted to finish the book to find out if you really were writing about the Bible.
Well, I both apologize and I also appreciate it. So,
I loved it. Have
Oh,
nothing
good.
else
Thank
to do anyway.
right, yeah, at that hour.
All right, group. I will let you know about the next book, and then we'll you'll just, you know, if you're signed in for our emails, then you'll hear about the next book then.
Okay.
Right,
Thank you so
Mimi.
much, Tim. And
Bye.
we'll be looking for your next book too.